and the winds will stay pretty light. Often cloudy through the rest of the day across the UK, rain and strong winds continuing across northwest Scotland. And that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching GB News, and on today's Political Correction I'm joined by Michael Portillo and Paul Embry. Coming up this morning, Conservative MP Nusrat Ghani says her Muslimness led to a demotion from her post as Transport Minister. We discuss the Sue Gray report, which is expected to be released this week, and is diplomacy with Russia possible? Strong words have been issued by Foreign Secretary Liz Truss as Putin turns up the pressure on the Ukrainian border. That plus plenty more after the latest news headlines here on GB News.
Good morning. It's just gone 10 o'clock. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. The government chief whip has rejected claims he told an MP she was sacked from her ministerial post because of her Muslimness. Nusrat Ghani lost her job as Transport Minister in 2020. Speaking to the Sunday Times newspaper, she said she was told it was because her faith was making colleagues uncomfortable. Mark Spencer strongly denies her claims and says he considers her remarks defamatory. The former Education Secretary has been accused of threatening to withdraw funds for a school after an MP considered voting against the government. Christian Wakeford, who recently defected to Labour, says he was warned to consider what he was doing before voting against a motion over free school meals. He told the Sunday Times Gavin Williamson, a former chief whip, had made the comment. Mr. Williamson says he doesn't remember the conversation. The former Housing Secretary is calling for the national insurance hike, which he approved, to be postponed. Robert Jenrick says the government is responding to the cost of living crisis lamentably slowly. He added that confronting harsh realities is part of alleviating the situation for low and middle income families. Britain has accused the Russian president of plotting to install a pro-Moscow leader as head of the government in Ukraine. In an unusual move, the Foreign Office named former Ukrainian MP Yevhen Muryev as a potential pro-Kremlin candidate to take over in Kiev. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says it shines a light on the extent of Russian activity designed to subvert Ukraine. The former head of the army, Richard Dannett, told GB News the West needs to work out what Putin's objective is.
We have to remember that scrape him to the core and you find an unreconstructed KGB colonel whose beloved Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union was destroyed by the cohesion of the West in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. And what he would like to achieve more than anything else is to sow discord and doubt amongst the minds of NATO members and break up that cohesion of NATO.
Officials have confirmed the death of a 49-year-old British man in Thailand amid reports he was attacked for partying too loudly. A second man was taken to hospital following the incident yesterday morning. Local media is reporting that the suspect has a history of mental health issues. The chairman of the Royal College of GPs says compulsory vaccinations for NHS staff in England is not the right way forward and is urging the vaccine deadline to be delayed. Martin Marshall told the BBC that it could lead to workforce shortages as staff refuse the jab. This comes as health workers protested against the mandatory jabs in London yesterday by laying out their uniforms on the steps of Trafalgar Square. New Zealand's Prime Minister has postponed her wedding due to coronavirus restrictions. Jacinda Ardern said tougher rules were needed after 9 cases of the Omicron variant were confirmed in Auckland earlier this month. She was meant to get married next weekend. And the oldest working cinema in the UK has finally reopened. The Electric Cinema in Birmingham, under new management, has opened again after more than a year of continuous closures due to COVID. The new owners say the pandemic was the biggest existential crisis the industry has faced. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, though, it's back to the political correction.
Well, good morning. You are watching GB News. On today's political correction, I'm joined by Arlene Foster and, of course, Paul Embry. Came out this morning, Conservative MP Nusrat Ghani says her Muslimness led to a demotion from her post as Transport Minister. We discuss Sue Gray's report, which is expected to be released this week, as it was last week. Is diplomacy with Russia possible? Strong words have been issued by Foreign Secretary Liz Truss as Putin turns up the pressure on the Ukrainian border. That plus plenty more after the news headline. So, what do we...
So the front page of the Sunday Times this morning can't be easy reading for the PM. The paper has an interview with the Conservative MP and former Minister Nusrat Ghani.
So she claims she was forced from her role at the Department of Transport due to, quotes, her Muslimness, making colleagues, quotes, uncomfortable.
The Chief Whip, Mark Spencer, of course, has denied the allegations from Ms Ghani, but her revelations are the latest in a relentless stream of suggestions of questionable behaviour of government whips. And, of course, Michael, you were a government whip at one time.
I was briefly a government whip.
Briefly.
My view, actually, is that, on the whole, the whips are pussycats, because they are, amongst other things, they are the HR, the Human Relations Department of the government. So they spend a lot of time communicating the worries of members of Parliament, whether personal or political, to the establishment, to the top. Of course, when it comes to a crucial vote, they get together and they apply all sorts of pressure to people to vote in the way that they should. Christian Wakeford, for example, says that he was threatened with the defunding of a school. By the way, it turns out that the school was funded in the end. That money has gone forward. But I can imagine that a whip would say to him, look, you are about to vote against a department because this was the matter of free school meals. You're about to vote against the policy of this department, but this department is offering money for a school in your constituency. Now, is that just, a reasonable point to make, or is it extraordinary pressure? On the whole, I think the members of Parliament, maybe the 2019ers, are being a bit snowflakish. When you think about it, they've been very happy to take money for their constituencies. If you follow their tweets, they're always talking about their new high street and how they put on pressure on the government, and the government has delivered all this stuff. So pork barrel politics is present, and what they're complaining about, perhaps, is when every now and again there is a threat to turn off the pork barrel. And let's just remember the stakes are pretty high, because what some of them apparently are doing is trying to bring Boris Johnson's political career to an end in a humiliating way. I think you would push back in those circumstances, wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, I'm worried about what seems to be a clear lack of moral fibre on the part of certain MPs. I mean, you know, as you mentioned, Michael, you would expect members of Parliament who are making life and death decisions sometimes in the chamber in the way that they vote, and they have to have these debates about national affairs, etc. You'd like to think they've got a bit of backbone. You'd like to think that they're not snowflakes. You'd like to think that if a party whip came along and started applying a bit of pressure, that they would have the wit and the wherewithal to withstand that. So if there are MPs who are genuinely claiming to feel harassed or bullied because a party whip has applied a bit of pressure, which, let's be honest, that's the nature of politics, I think I'd probably question whether they are equipped to be in the House in the first place. I mean, all of this talk about the police becoming involved and William Ragg now meeting with the Metropolitan Police, I'm deeply uneasy about that. I don't think the police should be getting involved in what is really the day-to-day cut and thrust of politics.
And to be honest, I'm quite sure the police don't want to be involved in it either, you know, because there's plenty of other things that they need to be involved in. I thought it was interesting, Nadine Dorries, who of course is a Boris loyalist, has tweeted today that she has been known to be the odd bit rebellious over this past 17 years as she's been an MP, and all she has faced from the Whip's office has been polite disappointment. So that's what she's saying today.
I think we ought to address the Nusrat Ghani accusation.
Oh, absolutely.
Obviously, this is a very important matter because it carries the implication that the Conservative Party is racist against Muslim people, which would be a very, very serious accusation. I'm not a member of the Conservative Party. I absolutely cannot speak for it. I would just say that I think I'm a little bit doubtful about this story. And maybe a couple of bits of evidence the other way around against the idea that the Conservative Party is institutionally racist. Nusrat Ghani is, after all, a Member of Parliament. She was selected as a Conservative for Wealden. Wealden is not a particularly Muslim place. I just looked it up, actually. In terms of colour, the population is 98.3% white. She was one of 21 Conservative Muslim candidates at the last election, of whom 4 were elected. You could say that's quite a small number, given the proportion of the population. And she was, of course, made a minister. But it's quite striking that the Chief Whip has taken the unusual step, not just of denying that he said it, but actually saying that the remarks were defamatory. So it looks like he is prepared to contest this. And, of course, it will, in the end, be one person's word against another.
And that's the point, Paul, isn't it?
Exactly, and the whole thing's very unedifying, actually, to have a Member of Parliament and, you know, one of the whips for the same party to be having this public spat. I mean, clearly, if a Member of Parliament makes an allegation of this seriousness, it has to be investigated. Clearly, it needs to be looked into. I mean, I have to say, I would find it incredible in this day and age if any politician, if any whip decided that it was appropriate to say, you know, you're going to be edged out of your position because of your faith, because of your Muslimness. So I mean, you know, we can't rush to judgment on these things. Innocent until proven guilty, that's the approach I think we need to take. But I guess there's also the dimension, and you both would know about this. If somebody has lost their job, if somebody feels that they haven't been promoted in the way that their abilities demand, and they're disgruntled, is it ever likely, God forbid, that politicians, call me cynical, would make these sorts of allegations as some kind of revenge for feeling that they've been overlooked?
And of course, that's the problem. Sour grapes in politics is very much evident. But I think, Michael, the problem with this is that it feeds into that narrative that was first started by Theresa May about the nasty party. And of course, the media love that sort of caricature of the Conservative Party.
Yes, I mean, this is what is, I think, pretty disappointing about it, pretty upsetting.
Yeah.
If this happened to Nusrat Ghani, I doubt whether her recollection is exactly right. She's held it in for maybe the best part of 2 years. Yeah. And she's released it now at a time when it can be supremely damaging, which, of course, is not a good word about the state of the Conservative Party. What we've seen, I think, is that there must have been a whips operation. Of course there has been, to shore up support. And we're seeing a reaction to it. At first I thought William Ragg was being rather naive in going to the police. I now think he's being rather sophisticated, because, of course, he's scaring off the whips. I mean, taking it to the police, for Pete's sake. They're going to have to be very careful what they say in future. But that Nusrat Ghani would want to bring her whole party into terrible disrepute. It does say quite a lot about the state of the party. I was just thinking earlier on Paul's point about, I think you used the word snowflake about MPs. The people who were elected in the province, who are elected in the province, they have to be very tough cookies. I mean, they have to live with the idea that they're going to be attacked, that they may be assassinated. I mean, to be in politics, you have to be pretty tough, don't you?
Well, you do have to be pretty tough. Of course you do. And to Paul's point about, you know, the calibre of politicians who haven't the moral fibre to say, well, whatever you think, Mr. Whip, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. I mean, that is exactly what you have to do. The whips are doing their job. I mean, if we're going to have an investigation into this, we could probably have to go back to the Queen Elizabeth I court and have a look at what was going on then, or certainly go back to the Disraeli's time. I mean, this happens. Whips are doing their job. But have they overstepped the mark, I think, is the point.
Well, is it a sign of the times that we are a bit more now of a crybaby nation, that we do flaunt our emotions more than we used to? We don't really have that kind of stiff upper lip anymore. Has that filtered through to the upper echelons of public life, including Parliament? I mean, there's been quite a few examples over the last couple of years where MPs have broken down in the Commons when they've been recounting particular personal traumas or tragedies. That's becoming more and more frequent. Once upon a time, that sort of thing didn't happen. Now, some people might say, well, it's a good thing that MPs are showing themselves to be human. OK, I get that. But equally, do we want the chamber of the House of Commons to be almost like a kind of therapy workshop rather than the actual workshop of the nation, where we expect MPs to show a bit of resilience, to show a bit of backbone, and if they get a bit of stick, they take it on the chin. That's what I want from my members of Parliament, I have to say.
Spoken like a tough firefighter.
Correct.
Well, there you go.
But of course, there was other news this week with the defection of the Red Wall MP Christian Wakeford from the Conservatives to the Labour Party, and that has reopened the debate over whether an MP changing party should mandate a by-election.
Defections have occurred throughout British political history over issues from the Northern Ireland peace process to Brexit to the Iraq war. So, should there be a change in the rules surrounding elected officials who jump ship? Well, I rather think that if you're going to change party, you have been elected on a false premise and you probably should offer yourself up for re-election. It won't happen in this case because nobody wants it. The Conservatives don't want it because they'd probably lose.
Yes.
The Labour Party don't want it. It would so amuse me if it happened, because can you imagine the poor Labour Party workers in Bury South who spent years opposing this man, now solemnly going around the doors of their constituency, knocking on the doors and saying, vote for Christian Wakeford, he's the man, he's the one, he's the right person for Bury South. Can you just imagine it? Mayhem. So nobody wants this by-election, but I think ethically speaking, they ought to be prepared to offer themselves up.
Absolutely, it's a no-brainer for me. I mean, look, I'm very happy to welcome Comrade Wakeford to the Labour ranks. Why wouldn't I be? But
unlike young Labour and Momentum, who were very distressed
they really
by it
have
all.
Put up some resistance to it. But no, look, I mean, if the Labour Party's going to win an election, it's got to attract Tories with, you know, in places like Bury South with the views of Christian Wakeford. But there's a point of principle here. When people go into the ballot box at general elections, they do not just vote for the name; they vote for the party affiliation largely. And the truth is that voters in Bury South did not elect a Labour MP. They elected a Conservative MP. I might not like that, but the reality is that they did. And consequently, I think Christian Wakeford and all MPs who defect should do the decent thing, resign their seats and fight a by-election on the ticket of their new party.
And of course, I have to incriminate myself here because I moved parties way back in 2003, and there'll be people in Northern Ireland looking at the TV going, you didn't stand for a by-election. But of course, under the rules in the Assembly, it's a multi-seat constituency. So if I had have resigned my seat, they would have went to the next person on the Ulster-Unionist seat
You stick
list.
to that defence,
I will stick to that defence, and I think it's important that I do. So moving on then, it's expected that the findings from Sue Gray's investigation will be published by the end of this week, we hope, and the implications for the Prime Minister could be absolutely huge, but none of us knows what's going to be in this report. I think there are different takes on what the purpose of the report is. For me, she's trying to find out the facts of what happens, and then she'll bring that forward. Is that what you understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think her terms of reference are quite limited, aren't they? But from reports, she's a woman with integrity. She's a woman who's ruthless. She's a woman who will leave no stone unturned in pursuit of the facts. And I think the truth is, if Sue Gray comes to a view that Boris Johnson, either ignored the guidance or the law personally or was complicit in allowing others to do that, then it's very difficult to see circumstances in which he can continue. I mean, I think most people will look at it and think, we were living under the most rigid restrictions, and the vast majority of people followed those restrictions. I think a lot of those restrictions were nonsense. I think they were far too extreme. But nonetheless, they were in place at the time, and you cannot have a situation where the people who are making the rules ignore those rules with abandon. So if it criticises him in that regard, it's very difficult to see him carrying on, I think.
I think the passage of time is very, very important in all of this. This time last week, I thought it was going to come out, this report, on Thursday, and that would have been quite dramatic, the day after Prime Minister's questions. But now they're talking about next week. Well, next week could be the end of next week, and it might even slip into the week after. But supposing it pops out on Friday, for example, when all the members of Parliament are back in their constituencies, let's face it, these rebels are pretty poorly organised. They appear to be different factions. There's no central control. They basically scurried under the skirting boards now. There's none of them around to be interviewed. So if they are in their constituencies and they're having to communicate by WhatsApp while they're doing their constituency duties, I don't see them getting together particularly. And what's it going to tell us? Is it going to tell us anything that we don't know? I just have a feeling that the anger that was present last weekend has dissipated by this weekend, will be less again by next weekend. I think it would be quite hard for them to say, you know, I was waiting for this particular detail. OK, you know, that 40 people left Downing Street at 1 in the morning on the morning of the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. That may emerge. That would be a terrible thing, although it doesn't implicate the Prime Minister directly. I don't think they're going to have the knockout blow in this report.
Well, I have noticed just this last week as well, there has been more conversations about, there was a party, but what about what's happening in Russia? What about the cost of living crisis? What about the security of our energy and the cost of our energy? People are moving on. And I think you're right on that, Michael. But it will be, of course, there'll be a feeding frenzy when the report comes out, Paul, because everybody will be wanting to see what's there.
I mean, I think you're right to a certain degree that there are much bigger things at play out there in the big wide world, which focuses the minds of the public. But I also think it's true that the electorate hate hypocrisy.
Oh, they do.
They hate hypocrisy and they hate impropriety, and they feel that if they are making sacrifices, regardless of whether or not you think, as I said, the restrictions were legitimate, if they are making sacrifices and they see their leaders saying one thing and doing another, that does anger people. And although you may be right, Michael, in terms of the anger amongst Tory MPs dissipating, but whether it will among the public, I mean, as I understand, Tory MPs, their inboxes are overfilled with angry constituents. And when the report comes out, that may happen again. So they may be subject to that pressure from their constituents, possibly.
These MPs are having to calculate something which is incalculable, which is what will be the degree of anger in 2.5 years' time when there might be a general election. Now, I think what I'm saying is that whereas last weekend they probably thought there's no way that Boris will be forgiven for this, even in 2.5 years' time, therefore we should get rid of him. With the passage of time, they might think, my goodness, if tempers have cooled that much in 1 week, how much might they have cooled in 2.5 years? I mean, really, will people remember this very vividly?
You're not suggesting that Tory MPs would place opportunism over principle, surely?
Of course I am. This whole thing is about their seats. We all know that. And in a way, so it should be. It's all about winning the respect and support of the public. But the second half of their decision is, whatever conclusion they reach about what people may think about Boris in 2.5 years, do they think Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, Liz Truss is a better bet? I mean, that is a fantastic gamble to take, and I think if I still were a Tory MP, which is hard for me to imagine, I probably wouldn't take the gamble.
Yeah. Well, coming up on the political correction, as Vladimir Putin moves troops to the Ukrainian border, we're asking if diplomacy with Russia is possible.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview Channel 236.
On Sky, we're Channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. Well, you've been flooding us with your views. Arlene.
So we're both putting on our glasses now, and there was a little bit of Twitter action last week about your glasses, so I thought I'd wear mine this week as well. So Chris is saying, regarding the minister forced from her role, I'm very disappointed that this lady has cause to raise this. My first instinct, however, is that other factors are more likely, as the religion of Islam has not held Sajid Javid back in the Tory party.
And Karen says, I think the allegations are a lie, but she has herself on the front page of the papers.
Not much sympathy for her so far. On that point, Sajid Javid, I was just looking this up, actually. Sajid Javid is from a Muslim background. He's not a practicing Muslim. Both his parents are Muslims, although I think the point might well hold.
Sure.
And Trevor says there seem to be a few MPs trying to rock the boat. If this were true, why are there two Muslims in the cabinet? Well, I don't know the religions of people, actually, so I don't know whether that's
Nadeem
the
Zahawi
case or not.
Nadeem, of course, yeah. Phil says, if this allegation is found to be untrue, will the above lady face disciplinary measures for false allegations, or will redress of her accusation be viewed as racism?
And Mel says she was an appointee of Theresa May, and look at her voting record against the government on COVID measures, and the answer can be found.
And Andy says, why has it taken so long for her to report? And should we just have a couple of views on the parties and Partygate and so on?
Yes, so Adrian is saying, of course, Winston changed parties twice. And to paraphrase, anyone can rat, but to double rat.
And Alan says, voting for a party and not a candidate is not good for democracy.
And Alison says, very plainly, all who attended parties should be sacked. Well, just before we turn to the Russia issue, in the northeast of England, there's an industrial boost on the way with a government investment programme of £100 million to facilitate the mass production of electric car batteries with British Volt, which is based in Blythe in Northumberland. It's set to be Britain's first large-scale gigafactory, expecting to generate 5,000 new jobs.
Boris Johnson said of the news, British Volt's plan to build a new gigafactory in Northumberland is a strong testament to the skilled workers of the North East and the UK's place at the helm of the global green industrial revolution. So with the explosion of demand for new green technology, levelling up and fresh trade deals, is post-Brexit Britain seeing a re-industrial revolution? Now, Paul, I know this is one that you were very interested in.
Yeah, and it's good news because I think communities like Blythe in Northumberland, other post-industrial communities, need these kind of solid blue-collar jobs, which once upon a time were there in abundance, but as a result of deindustrialisation, thousands of those jobs have vanished overseas. So it's good to see them coming back, because they are, in many respects, I think, those solid blue-collar jobs, the lifeblood of local communities. And I think, this needs to be part, in my view, of a wider industrial strategy, particularly in the post-Brexit world, or in the Brexit world, I should say. Arguably, we could not have done this within the European Union. We know that the European Union has very strict state aid rules to ensure a level playing field. One of my big bugbears as someone on the left who supported Brexit is the way in which EU restrictions prevent us from subsidising manufacturing, investing, because of those level playing field rules. So it's good, it's positive. These manufacturing jobs, as I say, are often the backbone, or were once upon a time, of those communities. It's good to see them return, but we need more. We need more of this type of thing.
Well, as well as that, I mean, it's good to see people talk about green jobs, and there should be more green jobs coming as a sort of a balance to the argument about cutting some of the manufacturing. So it's good to see those coming online, and to the northeast as well, of course.
I have seen extraordinary things on my travels with a camera.
Yeah.
Mainly in the green energy space, but for example, turbines, wind turbines. You cannot believe the size of these things that are being manufactured in Britain. I mean, the blades are the length of a football pitch, and they then stand on a tower, which obviously has to be correspondingly big. And these things are being churned out in hundreds, and then they're towed off, a long way offshore. So this is pretty large-scale stuff. And I think wind energy is only the beginning of it, because, it's famously unreliable. But wave energy and tidal energy are much more reliable. And again, we could well be in the forefront of some of these developments. The one thing that bothers me, of course, is how the story began, which was a £100 million investment by the government. In other words, are these things viable on their own? Because, of course, all of green energy at the moment is hugely subsidised, and we know that because it comes back into our bills, and we know that that is now going to be a huge part of the cost of living problem. So are these industries viable on their own? I imagine, Paul, that you would be perfectly happy to see pump priming, in other words, that the money's there at the beginning, but that it is not left there in the long term.
Well, certainly pump priming, I think, is important, because arguably some of these projects just wouldn't get off the ground without government intervention. And I do believe that the government should play an active role in the manufacturing sector in helping us to reindustrialise. I think there is huge talent in this country for this type of thing, but I think we've focused so much over recent years on the importance of the city, on the importance of finance capital, and we've really kind of ignored the demands of the real economy, the productive sector, where goods are made and wealth is produced. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. We don't invest enough. We don't invest enough because we're not particularly competitive. Because we don't invest enough, productivity is retarded. So there are all sorts of macroeconomic questions, I think, that need to go into this debate. But ultimately, get these things off the ground, secure those jobs, and I'm sure this will be a success, and we need to see more like it.
One of the things I found interesting is it's not just, as it were, shipyards or brownfield sites that are becoming manufacturing places for turbines and so on. A place like Grimsby, which obviously lost all its fishing due to the European Union and the Cod Wars. Grimsby is now heavily involved in the maintenance of these
offshore
turbines. So there's a whole new industry going into an old fishing port, which is really very, very encouraging indeed. By the way, these are jobs that people will not be able to do from home. They jolly well need to turn up and do them.
Well, there we go.
No, I think this is good news. It is good news, and it's good to see those type of jobs being brought about. But I did a piece on my Friday show recently about the ethical part of this, which is about where they mine the cobalt and the lithium for these batteries. Obviously, we need to have batteries to have the storage in terms of renewable energy, but there are some quite awful horror stories about children working in the DRC, for example, in getting the cobalt out. So we had talked at one stage about the ethical policies of some of these companies, and obviously this is one that I hope that British companies will take into consideration when they are getting that source.
It's an effect of the new global market.
Sure.
That big corporations are exploiting some of those poorer countries in terms of their resources, in terms of exploiting the labour force and not giving people decent working conditions, in terms of exploiting the environment. And that can only be tackled, I think, on a global scale because, as I say, it is a manifestation of globalisation itself.
Sure.
And of course, we should not be profiting on the backs of the exploitation of poorer countries. That is rule one as far as I'm concerned.
Neither do we want, China or Russia to blackmail us if they have the supplies.
No, well, that is absolutely right. I mean, I take the view that we should be helping the government of the DRC to deal with the issue rather than just ignoring it and saying we can't do anything there. But, Michael, you also have a story involving the government's COVID loan scheme, quite shocking figures.
Well, yes. I saw a story in the Financial Times this week. There was a case of a man who'd been given a £50,000 loan by the government, supposedly to prop up his business that had been damaged by COVID. It turned out this was a fellow who had, I think, 48 convictions. And the judge in the case said, how has it been possible for the government to give a £48,000 loan to someone with a very long criminal record? Now, I rather fear that this is only the tip of the iceberg. About £47 billion has been paid out in loans. This programme was applauded, but how well has it been administered? One estimate is that about 1/3 of these loans will not be recovered. That is not to say they're all fraudulent, but they won't be recovered one way or another. Quite a large proportion are thought to have been the result of fraud. The information I'm getting is that really the government had deployed no anti-fraud resources in this. I mean, there are anti-fraud experts. There are people who can smell fraud at a distance, but they were not employed. So civil servants are out there pushing the money out of the door in this most remarkable case of all, giving it to someone with a long criminal record. By the way, in the case that's mentioned that was in court last week, there were 2 people who'd actually received loans with criminal records. I think this is a very big scandal. And just to give you an idea of the size of money we're talking about, so a penny on income tax raises £5.5 billion. So if 1/3 of these loans are unrecoverable, let's call that about 17 billion, that's equivalent to 3 pence on income tax. And members of Parliament will be saying, why are we having a national insurance rise when the government is wasting such huge sums of money? Does this make you as indignant as I am?
Well, I mean, we have to look as well at the cases that we don't necessarily know about, the ones that have slipped through the net and we may never know about. Now, of course, we were at the beginning of a pandemic when these loans the loan facility was put into place. And there were all sorts of competing priorities for the government at the time. But it strikes me that that's not really an excuse when you are talking about billions and billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. I do not believe it was beyond the capability of government to get proper governance procedures in place and auditing procedures in place to make sure that those applying for the loans and receiving them were above board. Because, as I say, this is money that people have worked hard and paid through the exchequer out of their taxes. So I think you're right to be indignant because it is a genuine scandal.
And I think the pressure on the government now to either postpone or cancel that national insurance rise, this all becomes part of that conversation, doesn't it? Because the Chancellor has said he needs the money. You can't just make up money, but yet there are billions of pounds that went out to people who shouldn't have received the help. And
I mean, I was against the national insurance rise simply because I think it's a tax largely on the poorest. I would like to see a wealth tax of some kind to deliver that money. So, I mean, it would be wrong, I guess, for policy to be changed on the back of this because, what happened was completely unethical. However, if we can find a way of taxing people fairly so that people with the biggest shoulders bear the broadest burden, then all well and good in my view.
Something that makes me cross is that for track and trace, they brought in consultants at £1,000 a day. Well, why didn't they bring in anti-fraud consultants? I would have paid them £2,000 a day if they saved us some money.
Well, they would have saved that money back and much, much more. So we're going to move on, and coming up on the political correction, we'll discuss the escalating situation in Ukraine, so don't go away.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back to the political correction. Russia has denied claims that it is planning an invasion of Ukraine, despite having moved 100,000 of its troops to the border.
The international community has condemned the move, with Foreign Secretary Liz Truss had this warning to Russia.
They claim they want stability while they work to threaten and destabilise others. We know what lies down that path and the terrible toll in lives lost and human suffering it brings. That's why we urge President Putin to desist and step back from Ukraine before he makes a massive strategic mistake.
Earlier this week, the United States' Secretary of State Antony Blinken said if Russian military forces move across Ukraine's border, it will be met with a swift, severe and united response. Well, let's hope that that would be the case, but I wonder whether Vladimir Putin hasn't already achieved quite a lot of what he wanted. I'm very struck by this article in the Telegraph today. The EU's deafening silence on Russian aggression makes war more likely. Now, that is written by Tom Tugendhat, MP, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who was a Remainer, of course. But the point that he is making is that because Germany appears to have been blackmailed by receiving gas supplies from Russia and is opposing even the onward sale of NATO weapons to Ukraine, because France seems determined to strike a distinctive posture from the United States, whatever that might be, he thinks that this hesitancy has actually made war more likely. I'm not sure about that, but what I would say is that Vladimir Putin must be absolutely delighted to see the NATO allies striking different postures, and many of them pretty unimpressive. That's without even talking about President Biden's terrible gaffe the other day when he appeared to suggest that an incursion would be tolerated.
Well, I think it was a minor incursion, but then what does that mean? Does that mean you only come in at 20 miles, 30 miles, take over one city, two cities? It was a dreadful statement. And then his own spokespeople spent the whole of the rest of the week trying to backpedal from what that meant. And Antony Blinken, as you know, was over in Geneva having those talks with the Russians. And I understand Ben Wallace is going to continue with that. And actually, I think Ben Wallace has been a very good defence secretary in everything that he has been doing around Russia. How do you think our own government has reacted?
Well, I think there's a mainstream narrative here which is slightly concerning, which depicts Putin, who is unquestionably a tyrant, but in this situation as the would-be aggressor, champing at the bit to invade Ukraine, and NATO and the West, the US and the UK, as the good guys. But I think there's an argument to say that in many cases, what Putin has been doing is reacting to what he sees as a threat. You know, the sort of relentless expansion of NATO eastwards, Ukraine obviously on the border of Russia, NATO manoeuvres in the Black Sea and in Western Ukraine, the Ukrainian government being armed by the UK and the US. I just wonder if, for example, if America found that Russian missiles were being based in Mexico. Look back to Cuba, for example, in 1962, when Soviet missiles, the plan was to locate Soviet missiles on Cuba. The Americans probably understandably went mad because they saw it as a threat. So yes, of course, countries are sovereign, but countries are not islands in the metaphorical sense. You know, there's a huge geopolitical game being played, and I fear that we're stoking up the situation unnecessarily.
I don't know whether your analogy with Cuba is exact, but would you, if you were making NATO foreign policy, would you accept a Russian sphere of influence that covered Ukraine?
Well, I don't think it's a question of whether you accept it. I think that it's a geopolitical reality, Michael. You know, we live in a world where countries like Russia and China and the US will try to exert force, whether economic or military, beyond their own borders. Now, we're not in a Cold War. The modern-day Russia has no power, in my view, nothing like the power of the old Soviet Union. It's conceded enormous amounts of territory over the last kind of 30 years. And it seems to me almost as if we're creating an enemy unnecessarily. And that's not, as I say, to downplay the tyranny of the Russian regime. But we were told, for example, when Trump was elected that Russia was behind it. Turned out that was nonsense. When we voted for Brexit, we were told Russia was behind it. Turns out it was nonsense. I suspect that this suggestion that they're about to invade Ukraine will turn out to be nonsense as well.
Well, we're now joined by Valery Morozov. He's a former Kremlin whistleblower and he's now a Russian analyst. Of course, we want to hear what you have to say, Valery. We're talking about this discussion, but what way do you read what's happening at the moment?
I think that what is going on, especially around Ukraine, is the cover-up of the really important negotiations and talks which are going inside, deep, mainly between the United States, Russia, and maybe China. And China, not maybe India. At least Putin wants India to be involved. And of course, in any case, in the nearest future, there will be no invasion unless Putin is forced, by different circumstances. But let us just take, say, for example, 100,000 troops, which are a lot of noise and a lot of talks is going on. Actually, the length of the Russian-Ukrainian border is nearly 2,500 kilometers. That is approximately from Moscow to London.
Yeah.
Also, it is included the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. It is 1,100 kilometers. It is from London or Moscow to Berlin. On this length, you are saying that there is 100,000 troops. That is in the depth of 400 kilometers. That is calculated inside Russian territory. That is 20 soldiers per 1 kilometer of the border, or 400 square kilometers of the Russian territory. 10 soldiers.
You make the point well, but presumably the operation would not be to take over all of Ukraine. I believe Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after Russia. It would be an operation of the sort we've already seen. We've seen Crimea go, we've seen Donbass go to Russian-backed forces. It would be an incursion of that sort. But are you saying they're simply not going to do it? I can imagine that they would get very badly bogged down in a war against such a large country, and a country where I think quite a lot of people are determined to maintain their independence. So I can see that the prospect of such a war
we have to look at the facts. Last year, the trade turnover between Russia and Ukraine increased by approximately 70%, including fuel, petrol, diesel. That is what is coming to Ukraine. And that is what is used by the Ukrainian army, by Ukrainians, civilians, their private cars and all those things. Russia is exporting electricity through Belarus. Russia is one of the main, and Belarus are one of the main partners, trade partners, and it is increased. Say, for example, the same fuel, there's more than 80% increased in the last year. What is the purpose of invading if you can stop simply supplying electricity and fuel? In Ukraine now, it is from -5 to -20. Just imagine if Putin decides to stop it.
Sure.
There will be the living standard in Ukraine is 3 times lower than in Russia. A lot of opposition.
Tell us about this global idea that Putin has to involve the United States, Russia, China, and maybe India. What is the settlement that he wants to see?
I think it is not even Putin. Putin is reacting. I think this is the idea of Biden. At least the initiative was from Biden. And for the first time when they met in Geneva, I think they discussed it. Actually, this is new architecture of international relations. And on the top of this architecture, there will be at least three, the United States, Russia, and China. Putin went to India. They signed a huge agreement with India. And now there is a big game, a great game. Who will be, how it will be distributed, how the world will be, where it will be, Europe also. Of course, the problem with Europe is that it has no military power, and compared to Russia or the United States.
Valery, would there be support in Russia among the people, the citizens, for any invasion of Ukraine?
No. And there is no support in Kremlin, and there is no idea. Russians understand that Ukraine is going to collapse by itself, economically and politically. And time is playing for Russians. And Putin just wants a certain moment, how he'll use his, all these levers to speed up the collapse or take over control. But he will not take over control by military invasion. That will be the last result. Actually, you should understand from the beginning, the collapse of the Soviet Union was initiated by Russia. And that is the only one party which was for this. And in 1947, the people who were actually the closed allies of, and not supporters, but, favorites of Stalin were arrested and executed. And the criminal case at that time was called the Russian case. It was the first attempt after the war to stop donating by Russia, to stop donating these republics, and let them go separately or whatever. That was the idea, a sort of Finlandization. At that time, Stalin arrested, executed, including Kuznetsov, for example, who was or it was called also Leningrad Group. They were coming from, with the war. They were leaders during the war of the Leningrad and the Leningrad siege, very popular, heroic people. But they were arrested and executed. So these ideas were developing still in Russia. And that was the ideas which came in beginning of 1980s. I knew these people who were behind this.
Coming to today, do you think that NATO, the United States, can accept something that Putin will put on the table, his idea of a new global arrangement?
I think yes, because that is the whole purpose of this talk around Ukraine, because actually Russia is not asking for Ukraine. Russia is asking to take out the bases from the Eastern Europe, not Ukraine. Russia is asking to take the United States to remove nuclear weapons from Europe. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. These were the main demands of Putin now. But the talk actually is only about Ukraine, where Putin doesn't want to invade. He doesn't want to get problems.
Rather backing up Paul's point that We need to look at what NATO and the United States have been doing as well. But I think it will be very, very difficult for the United States to accept an idea of spheres of influence, which I think is probably implicit in the Putin grand plan that you describe.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really good to have your take on it, Valerie, as well, because we've been hearing a lot about Putin and what he's thinking and wanting to go back to 1917 Russia and all of these sorts of things. So thank you so much for coming in and giving us your perspective.
Well, you're
thank
welcome.
you. Thank you.
Arlene, why has a small Irish town hit the headlines this week?
Well, this is quite an incredible story. And of course, we do have to remember that there's a deceased in this story. But apparently, two individuals took a corpse. And we're not sure whether the man was already dead or whether he died when he went in to the post office to claim pension. Now, you'd have to be pretty desperate to get the pension to bring a dead man in to claim his pension. And apparently there were only allowed 3 people in the post office at the time due to COVID restrictions. And the Sunday Telegraph has quite an amusing editorial which says that is some civic commitment in keeping the COVID regulations even when you're dead. But I have to say, in Northern Ireland, as you know, sometimes we make the joke that even the dead can vote. But here we have a dead man being brought into a post office to claim his pension.
Well, only in Ireland.
Only in
as
Ireland.
you say, we need to remember that the Parcel is dead, but it seems incredible. It struck me of the old 40 Towers episode, The Kipper and the Corpse, where one of the guests died and they've got him plonked up on a chair in the lobby and pretending that he's still alive. But what sort of mindset would do? I mean, were they drunk or something? Why would anyone even conceive of taking a dead body into a
But it's how they thought they could get away with it, Paul.
Yeah.
That's the incredible thing that I can't understand.
Yeah, they're not heard of remote working in the internet.
No, obviously not. Anyway, now on to another serious topic. The Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, has given magistrates tougher sentencing powers in a bid to reduce a backlog of cases clogging the Crown courts.
The reform, which will come into effect within months, doubles the maximum prison sentence that can be handed down in a magistrate's court in England and Wales from 6 months to 1 year. Now, as I understand it, the defendant will still have the right to elect to go to jury trial, but there will be a broader range of cases that can be heard by magistrates. Therefore, the overall effect will be that there will be fewer jury trials. I looked this up the other day. The concept of trial by jury goes back to 1215, which is the year of Magna Carta, and it's mentioned in Magna Carta, although apparently it was an edict of Pope Innocent III that brought it in. But nonetheless, Magna Carta has cemented the jury, not only in English law, but also, by the way, in American law. It's regarded as something, virtually untouchable and sacred. Here's Dominic Raab proposing a change, and I would just like to throw into the mix whether the jury is fit for purpose today. I mean, I tremble if I get a jury summons because I don't want my life to be disrupted. I tremble also because if I were on a long fraud case, would I be able to make a reasonable judgment? Would I be able to follow the evidence? Would I, having sat there for months, find that 2 of the jurors had died and the whole trial was called off? It's quite a delicate, quite a flimsy system. And whilst I understand what was being defended in 1215, we were defending against arbitrary government by the king. Against what are we being defended in 2022? What does the jury trial defend us against, I wonder?
Well, I guess we may never know, but there's the potential that any state, any political actors will try to cook up particular charges against an individual and pursue a political prosecution or persecution of that individual because of his or her views, his or her activities. And, the truth is that the jury system, where people are tried not by the state, not by state actors, but by an independent jury of their peers, is crucial, I think, in acting as a bulwark against that untrammeled state power.
On a jury?
I have.
What was your experience? Positive, negative?
It was broadly positive. It struck me that the jury room was sacrosanct, which of course is how it should be. The discussions that went on in there were completely uninfluenced by anybody outside of the room. Because we're not ultimately entitled to know what the jury are discussing and why they come to the decisions that they do. So I would be really concerned about any move away from...
Any?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's an
Arnie,
argument...
what do you think of what's actually been proposed?
Well, what's been proposed is not actually cutting down your right to a jury trial, because if the defendant feels strongly about it, he can still request a jury trial. What it's really moving from, as I understand it, ordinarily the magistrates only deal with cases that have up to 6 months imprisonment, and now they're moving that to 12 months imprisonment. So those cases that can be tried either way, in other words, in the magistrates' court or in the Crown Court, I think what they're trying to do is deal with them in the magistrates' court so that they are lifting some of the pressure on the Crown Court. And I think that's a sensible thing to do. I really do.
Do you know, although I've raised the matter of principle, and I've talked about the fragility of the jury system, nobody actually is questioning the matter of principle. I mean,
think that's right.
Very fast out of the traps were all the lobby groups from the legal profession, who do apparently very much believe in the jury system. Of course, some of us, our faith in the jury system was a little bit shaken by some recent decisions, particularly in the case of the Edward Colston statue defendants, where the jury decided that they were justified in committing criminal damage. I can't remember how you felt about that one.
I thought the verdict was inexplicable. I think we discussed it on the show at the time. I think it was perverse. But as I argued at the time, if you believe in a jury system, you have to suck up these types of decisions. Sometimes there will be these sorts of inexplicable decisions, but we don't know why the jury in that case came to the decision that it did. All we did know is that they believed that the individuals involved were not guilty. And if we support the system, we have to like it or lump it. And in this case, we have to like it because it's absolutely the right system, in my view.
I do agree with that. Another fragility has been exposed in the Ghislaine Maxwell case, where it appears that a juror had a sort of conflict, had a predetermined position. That trial may be called into question now.
Yeah.
There's arguably a case, I think, to say there should be a particular minimum age limit, or there should be an educational qualification on juries. But the jury system as a principle, a bedrock of our justice system, I think needs to be defended at all costs.
Yeah.
We will defend it on the political correction. And coming up, as Joe Biden commences his second year as President of the United States, we speak to his longtime friend, Bob Mulholland, about his successes and failures so far.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Good morning, you're watching GB News. On today's Political Correction, I'm joined by Michael Portillo and Paul Embry. Coming up this morning, we're joined by Joe Biden's long-term friend, Bob Mulholland, to discuss his first year as US President. following an announcement by Justice Secretary Dominic Raab implementing the biggest change to the judicial system in 140 years, we ask if the jury system is being eroded. And we discuss whether the AA were right in apologising for not prioritising a lone woman whose car had broken down in the middle of the night. That plus plenty more after the latest news headlines here on GB News.
Good morning, it's 1 minute past 11. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. The government chief whip has rejected claims he told an MP she was sacked from her ministerial post because of her Muslimness. Nusrat Ghani lost her job as Transport Minister in 2020. Speaking to the Sunday Times, she says she was told it was because of her faith that was making colleagues uncomfortable. Mark Spencer strongly denies her claims and says he considers her remarks defamatory. The Deputy Prime Minister says there won't be a specific investigation. The former Education Secretary has been accused of threatening to withdraw funds for a school after an MP considered voting against the government. Christian Wakeford, who was recently defected to Labour, says he was warned to consider what he was doing before voting against a motion over free school meals. He told the Sunday Times Gavin Williamson, a former Chief Whip, had made the comment. Mr Williamson says he doesn't remember the conversation. The former Housing Secretary is calling for the national insurance hike, which he approved, to be postponed. Robert Jenrick says the government is responding to the cost of living crisis lamentably slowly. He added that confronting harsh realities is part of alleviating the situation for low and middle income families. A suspect accused of killing a British man with a sickle is being questioned by police in Thailand. The 49-year-old was found dead in his home with knife wounds. Another man, who's 55, was injured while trying to stop the suspect. Police say a preliminary investigation found they were attacked for playing music too loudly in the early hours of Saturday morning. Britain has accused the Russian president of plotting to install a pro-Moscow leader as head of the government in Ukraine. In an unusual move, the Foreign Office named the former Ukrainian MP Yevhen Muriev as a potential pro-Kremlin candidate to take over in Kiev. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says it shines a light on the extent of Russian activity designed to subvert Ukraine. Former head of the army Richard Dannatt told GB News the West needs to work out what Putin's objective is.
We have to remember that scrape him to the core and you find an unreconstructed KGB colonel whose beloved Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union was destroyed by the cohesion of the West in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. And what he would like to achieve more than anything else is to sow discord and doubt amongst the minds of NATO members and break up that cohesion of NATO.
New Zealand's Prime Minister has postponed her wedding because of the reintroduction of COVID restrictions. Jacinda Ardern says tougher measures are needed after 9 cases of the Omicron variant were confirmed in Auckland earlier this month. She was planning to get married next weekend. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens now. Let's get back to the political correction.
Good morning, you're watching GB News. On today's political correction, I'm joined by Arlene Foster and Paul Embry. Came up this morning, we are joined by a long-term friend of Joe Biden to discuss his first year as United States President. We discussed whether the AA was right in apologising for not prioritising a lone woman whose car had broken down. Plus, we speak to the Queen's former chaplain in our regular feature, Common Ground.
So I think we're going to have a look at some GB views now. As always, you've been sending in your views to us on the stories that we've been covering. First of all, compulsory jabs for NHS staff. Susan says, I am triple jabbed and believe strongly in vaccines, but I defend anyone's right to refuse. However, personal choices come with consequences. Say I am double jabbed and have a booster. I've isolated for 10 days, but I still can't go and see my elderly parent in hospital. But a nurse who is looking after her hasn't had any vaccines can go and be with my parent.
And we've got one here on Ukraine. Ian says NATO is looking for a win after the failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria and Yemen, so now has a go at Russia. The former NATO Soviet experts who can't speak Farsi, Arabic or Pashtun are now back in the game as well. The arms companies are also looking for another bonanza.
And Paddy says, why are we, meaning the United Kingdom, leading on Ukraine? Why isn't the European Union leading? They're deafening in their silence. This is not a UK war.
Absolutely. And John is saying Russia's protecting its borders from the Yanks, who, correct me if I'm wrong, but started displaying their weapons along the borders around Russia maybe 10 years ago till now. Britain should stay out of it as if conflict does start. You can't trust this US president, especially as he got out before we Brits were ready. I think that's about Afghanistan at the end there.
And from Leona, Russia has every right to defend itself and its borders against NATO aggression.
So keep your views coming in, and hopefully we'll get around to reading some of them later on as well. We're going to talk about America now, and President Joe Biden this week hit the first anniversary milestone of his presidency, hailing his own enormous progress in office.
President Biden's first year has seen some of the most tumultuous times in living memory, with personal approving ratings having dropped to 40% to a record 7% inflation. The pandemic, the crisis in Afghanistan, the fiasco of a 5G rollout. Joe Biden has defended his record. He admitted he should have delivered better on COVID testing, but said he had outperformed expectations, and he piled blame on Congress Republicans for failing to support measures to deal with the issues facing the nation.
Predicting that Russia will move in on Ukraine and the pandemic seemingly far from over in the United States of America, what's next for President Biden, and what can we conclude about his first year in the Oval Office? Joining us now is Bob Mulholland. Bob is a member of the Democratic National Committee, and he's a party strategist based in California. He's also a long-term friend of Joe Biden, and huge thanks to you, Bob, for staying up to speak to us. I understand It's about 3 o'clock in the morning there, so thank you for doing that. And what's your take on Joe Biden's first year?
Well, as one who was wounded in Vietnam, the number one thing for me was getting out of Afghanistan. 20 years, we should have left 20 years ago. So the economy is good. We got over 70% of the American people vaccinated. We got a long way to go. But the number one problem the president faces is the number, like 30 million plus Americans who so far have not been vaccinated. They're the people causing the school closing, causing the economic expansion to slow up, and causing problems that we don't need. But the good thing is 70% are vaccinated.
To speak to a veteran today, speaking to you, but my goodness, didn't the scenes as we pulled out of Afghanistan remind you of the scenes when we pulled out of Vietnam? And since we'd been through Vietnam, could we not have expected better from Joe Biden?
Look at Churchill was a success story out of Dunkirk. Even though tens of thousands of people were captured, thousands were murdered, killed on the spot because they couldn't get out soon enough. President Biden put the greatest air evacuation in the history of the world. Over 130,000 people got out in 3 weeks, including a lot of British people with the British military. So it's a success story. If anybody thinks people don't die in a war, I think they better reevaluate. The fact is, over 20 years, thousands of Americans, probably hundreds of British, and certainly hundreds of thousands of Afghans died in that war. I'm glad we're out of there. The last thing we need, if Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants to send British troops back to Afghanistan, he'll be out of Downing Street before his next party.
We are pleased to be your allies, Bob. But as your allies, I think many of us were pretty shaken the other day when we saw Joe Biden really just fluffing his lines and apparently giving the come on to Putin to do some sort of incursion into Ukraine. Is the president now in a condition where he can face a press conference, let alone face a summit with Vladimir Putin?
No. Every president has had moments where the press says, oh, look, he didn't say it exactly right. President Reagan had that problem many times. Trump certainly had that problem. Look, the real issue of Ukraine is, I don't know why NATO at the Berlin Wall came down, decided to expand east. We didn't need to do that. The best thing, the solution here is Ukraine to put out a statement we've decided we don't want to be part of NATO. And that could be the beginning of the end of this crisis. This is so absurd that we, NATO, have to go east. And Putin has not invaded Ukraine. Hopefully he doesn't. And what's going to happen if he does? The whole world's economy is going to collapse. So we got to just get that solved by Ukraine saying we don't want to be part of NATO. Simple solution.
Well, of course, it's up to Ukraine whether they do that or not. They're a sovereign nation, and I think we have to respect their right to make their own decisions. I think that's very important. But, Bob, you're very close to Joe Biden. Tell me, what do you put his ratings down to? You say to us that he's doing a good job. He was right to get out of Afghanistan. He himself acknowledged that there were difficulties with COVID and he maybe didn't act quickly enough. What do you put his ratings down to?
Well, I think the president, he was a great alternative to Trump, and mostly it was American women who put Biden in office because they just got tired of Trump. The thing about Biden is he's no Jack Kennedy, he's no Ronald Reagan, but he's stable and he's experienced and he understands the number one problem in America, like in Britain and many other countries, is COVID. And I'm very happy that I guess 500 million masks will be going out, 500 million tests will be going out. And the more we can get that distributed, we can keep our schools open, and Biden will do better. Remember, President Trump was always in the low 40s. I mean, President Trump never hit 50 as far as favorable rating. And this is a new year. Let's hope in America and in Britain that COVID-19 gets under control and we can get back to some kind of normalcy. That's where we all want to be.
Bob, you surely don't want to measure yourself against Donald Trump. President Biden promised to unite America, to bring Americans back together. Has he done that?
Politically, you cannot unite America. This country has always been divided. That's why we had the Civil War in the 1860s. The South wanted slaves. So politically, when Trump, I think, made it worse because he kept kind of talking about division, and that made it worse. And now we have thousands of people attacking our capital. We couldn't even protect our capital. I don't know what we think we're going to do with Ukraine. So it was important for President Biden to say that, and it is important for President Biden to continue saying that. But we're going to have division, and that's what a democracy is. You have division. I just hope we can quiet it down a little bit.
Bob, you talked about stability, and that's what we all want. Do you think the Biden presidency is stable? I'm afraid the president is looking pretty frail to me.
Compared to Reagan, he's looking pretty good.
You keep making comparisons, Bob.
The thing is that the president gets up every day. There's no bring your own booze parties. There's stability in the White House. There is the military feels comfortable with this president. Veterans feel comfortable with this president. And overall, I think President Biden will do a lot better this year because of COVID-19, or at least more people getting vaccinated. And that's going to be a big help to keep our schools open and expand our jobs. President Biden, under the economy of the first year, 7 million new jobs created in America, and there's 10 million jobs being advertised now. We can't find enough qualified people for the jobs.
Bob Mulholland, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, the president gets up every day, so that's all right.
Well, the planet is safe, isn't it?
I mean, they say offence is the best defence, I have to say, but that's quite incredible. Coming up on the political correction, we're going to discuss magistrates being given powers to double the current maximum sentence time to offenders in a bid to clear backlogs in the judicial system. But first, the weather.
And it's largely dry for many of us, but mainly cloudy skies are expected too. Looking at the details then, a cloudy morning expected across southwest England. Perhaps a few bright or sunny spells developing as we head towards lunchtime. Highs of about 8 Celsius with light winds for all. Grey skies overhead London and southeast of England too. It should remain dry though, feeling chilly with highs of 7. Winds remaining pretty light. Wales should see some of the brightest weather. Cloud will come and go, but there will be sunny spells, staying pretty chilly though. The Midlands, largely cloudy, should stay dry. There could be a few glimmers of sunshine from time to time. Temperatures just about 6. Winds remaining light throughout. Large amounts of cloud across northern England, the best of any cloud breaks to the east of the Pennines. Temperatures towards the coast about 8 Celsius. Patchy rain and brisk winds will continue across northwest Scotland through the day. Drier conditions are expected elsewhere with some sunshine in the east. Maximum temperatures of about 7 Celsius. Now, moving on to Northern Ireland, should remain dry through the rest of the morning. Some bright or sunny breaks developing by lunchtime. Temperatures of about 7 Celsius and the winds will stay pretty light. Often cloudy through the rest of the day across the UK. Rain and strong winds continuing across northwest Scotland. And that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join me, Mark White, here on GB News. For more than 2 decades, I've been at the sharp end of reporting crime and security at home and abroad. From the scourge of terrorism to the fight against violent crime and the deepening small boats crisis in the Channel, they're issues you rightly care about, and so do I. As GB News Home and Security Editor, my focus will be on the stories that matter to you.
So welcome back to the Political Correction. Before the break, we had a conversation with Bob Mulholland, a huge supporter, I think it's fair to say, of Joe Biden. And he made quite a defence, I have to say, for the president. What did you make of it, Michael?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to poke some fun at it.
Yeah.
He said he wasn't looking quite as fragile as Reagan. He said that the United States was divided, but it always had been, and kind of implied it wasn't quite as bad as the American Civil War, in which 600,000 Americans died. So let's try and think about how one would assess the Biden presidency. The economy, well, jobs are good. The employment scene is looking good. Inflation is very bad. The COVID situation, I think he's had some good points and some bad points. I mean, he's shown more direction than his predecessor did. He's perhaps overpromised on what he could do with vaccinations and testing facilities and so on. Foreign policy, this is a bit we look at in this country. I'm afraid I think it's been pretty disastrous. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan was calamitous. It had a terrible impact upon our opinion of Biden and on Americans' opinions of Biden. Although Bob Mulholland talked about getting Afghanis out, actually very few, I think, Afghanis who'd worked for the United States and not so very many who work for Britain actually have made it safely to the United States or to Britain. And then I thought the gaffe the other day about the incursions into Ukraine was very serious. Serious not only in itself, but the feeling that they'll never be willing to put the president on television again to make such gaffes. And can you imagine Biden going into a one-to-one with Putin? They'd never allow them in the room on their own together, would they?
I mean, I broadly agree with the assessment. I mean, certainly on COVID, he's had some successes. He got his pandemic relief bill through quite early on, which I think was the right thing to do. Afghanistan, I agree, was a complete catastrophe. Whether or not that had a big impact on his personal ratings within the US is questionable, because I suspect, as you said, the world would have been looking at that perhaps more so than America, where voters can be a little bit insular and a little bit parochial. I guess the main point is we were told when he was elected, look, the grown-ups are now back in charge. America will be, again, a leading player on the world stage. And I think there are serious concerns over his aptitude, frankly. And I don't think in terms of that, the grown-ups being back in charge, I don't think actually that's quite panned out in the way that they would have liked. The divisions are still there, unquestionably. I think, and this is the problem, I think the Democrats attribute the Trump period to some kind of aberration. You know, the American voters took leave of their senses, you know, then we've put that right and that won't happen again. The reality is those divisions are still very deeply ingrained in American society. As the Democrats have become, similar to the British Labour Party actually, in recent years become very much woke, very much kind of hyper-progressive in their general ideology, so they have alienated parts of working class America, the Rust Belt and places like that. Places that saw Donald Trump, and I'm certainly no fan of Trump at all, but who saw him as some sort of saviour. And those divisions, as far as I can see, haven't gone away.
And actually, I find it quite offensive, some of the commentary that comes out of the Biden administration towards those people who didn't support him. I mean, it can be very, very dismissive. You're right, the grown-ups were meant to be back in the room, and they were going to sort all the divisiveness out. But every time Biden speaks, and he doesn't speak that often, as we know, because that was his first appearance for 78 days in front of a camera. 78 days. Can you imagine Boris Johnson? And there was some criticism of him not being available for a camera for a week because of COVID. 78 days.
I mean, it's possible, I guess, that from a personal point of view, the presidency has come 10 years too late for him. Because,
I think that's right.
And as much as we absolutely, you know, challenge any sort of ageism, and of course, if people are good enough, they're young enough, but equally, as you get on in life, you don't have the same mental faculties, the same physical strength as you do when you're younger. That's just a reality and a fact of life, and we have to accept that. But I mean, your point, Arlene, is an interesting one in terms of his attitude towards people who voted for Trump, because don't forget, Hillary Clinton made the same error. She called Trump supporters, large parts of them, deplorables.
Correct.
Now, if you are serious about healing that divide and closing what is very clearly quite a large cultural divide in America, then writing off, the same as the Labour Party here, if you write off people who vote Tory as deplorables and people who you can't do business with and they're not worth trying to convince, and frankly, you don't deserve power.
Yeah.
Moving away from the personality of Biden, I mean, what of course is very disturbing for all of us about the United States is the extent to which it is polarised, which makes it a scarcely functioning state. I mean, one of the big programmes that Biden wanted to put through has stalled because he lost a single one of his senators who would not support it, which is fine. That's what people are elected to do. But it does mean that it's plunged him into paralysis. And we're talking about Biden's age. What about Trump's age? It is interesting to me that Biden has not been able to drive Trump away from the scene, or indeed, for that matter, the Republicans haven't been able to drive Trump away from the scene. It is astonishing to me that Trump, with what I thought was in many ways a disastrous presidency, is still dominating the right of politics in the United States, and who knows, could well have a go next time at the presidency. And if he doesn't, it's likely anyway to be a very much Trump-influenced candidate. And so the division will continue.
I think large parts of working-class America are prepared to forgive Trump his personal shortcomings, of which he has clearly got very many, in my view, because they feel that he articulates their concerns, that he actually is prepared to represent them and speak for them. Now, I profoundly disagree that Trump is the saviour of blue-collar America, working-class America, but nonetheless, that's how those people feel. These are people who, similar to the debate we've had about post-industrial areas in the UK, who feel left behind by globalisation, who feel that they are looked down upon and treated with contempt by the upper echelons of left-wing America, feel that their patriotism, their love for the nation state, their desire to produce things in America, to have a solid manufacturing base, to have decent blue-collar jobs that they can take pride in, is ridiculed in these days of globalisation, and they've had to suffer the same economic downturn as being told that actually you're culturally deplorable as well. And Trump speaks to that, and he defends them on that. And for as long as that's the case, I don't think he's going to go away. And he's clearly got the money as well to be able to publicise himself. So why would he go away?
Which is all important in American politics, of course. You need the money, as I often say. Anybody can be the American president as long as they have a couple of billion pounds behind them. I just think Biden's administration, and it's not just Biden, of course, whose popularity is very low. His vice president is even lower, as I understand it, Kamala Harris.
I was going to ask you about her. I mean, obviously, with a president who's looking this frail, you have to ask what may happen during the next 3 years. And Kamala Harris, I'm afraid, has not had a good year. Her ratings are very low. In interviews that she's given, she has not shown herself to be a person of depth and deep political understanding. And the couple of jobs that she's been given to do, which admittedly were very challenging jobs, because one of them in particular was to do with immigration from Spanish-speaking North America, she's not distinguished herself in those jobs. So I think things are looking pretty grim for the Democrat Party, because it's not evident who their next candidate would be. But we may not even get to that. With the president looking this frail, we have to ask what may happen during this administration.
It's funny you mention that, because he, in his 2-hour soliloquy about how brilliantly he was doing last week, he actually said that he would be running again and Kamala Harris would be his vice presidential candidate. So I thought that was an incredible statement to make.
I take it with a pinch of salt.
No, I think we all.
It's hard to look beyond the argument that Kamala Harris wasn't actually chosen through tokenism. I mean, it's an uncomfortable debate to have, but you have to have these debates. I mean, you look at somebody like Obama, the first black American president, who clearly was completely equipped to do that job in all sorts of ways, whether you agreed with him or whether you didn't agree with him. There was no question over his statesmanship, over his ability to be able to make big decisions, to understand the geopolitical situation at the time. He came across very well in the media. Kamala Harris has clearly got very few of those attributes, and as you say, Michael, if Biden were to disappear off the scene, you wouldn't be instilled with confidence if she stepped forward as the next American president. That's the truth of it.
Perhaps to introduce a slightly more encouraging remark, we were talking about whether the grown-ups were back in charge. I have been quite impressed by the Secretary of State, Blinken,
Anthony Blinken,
who has emerged back onto the scene in the last few days. And you know, today we've been thinking that maybe, I think most of us have been thinking that maybe this invasion of Ukraine is not, after all, imminent. And one of the reasons that's contributed to that feeling is that Blinken has engaged with the Russians and a sort of agenda is being formed. So I think in that sense, actually, the Biden administration may have brought some adulthood back into Washington.
He's a very sensible, very level, doesn't get excited about anything. And I think you're right. I think he is a grown-up dealing with very grown-up issues. I have said before now that I'm very confident of Ben Wallace and what he's doing for us in the UK as Secretary of State for Defence. So I think Blinken is a safe pair of hands as well.
Well, you would hope that some back-channel diplomacy is going on because, in my view, as we touched on earlier in the show, the public messaging has been inflammatory. And is more likely to lead to war than avert it. So, you know, I'm not instilled with confidence, but I hope those discussions are taking place.
So coming up, we're going to be joined by the Reverend Canon Dr. Gavin Ashenden to discuss what brings us together on common ground. But first, let's have the news.
Hello, it's 11:30. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. The government chief whip has rejected claims that he told MP Nusrat Ghani that she was sacked as transport minister in 2020 because of her Muslimness. Speaking to the Sunday Times, she says she was also told it was because her faith was making colleagues uncomfortable. Mark Spencer strongly denies the claims and says he considers her remarks to be defamatory. The former Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, is calling for the national insurance hike, which he approved, to be postponed. He says the government is responding to the cost of living crisis lamentably slowly. A suspect accused of killing a British man with a sickle is being questioned by police in Thailand. The 49-year-old was found dead in his home with knife wounds. Another man was injured and taken to hospital. Police say an initial investigation found they were attacked for playing music too loudly in the early hours of Saturday morning. Britain has accused the Russian president of plotting to install a pro-Moscow leader as head of the government in Ukraine. In an unusual move, the Foreign Office named former Ukrainian MP Yevhen Muriev as a potential pro-Kremlin candidate to take over in Kiev. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says it shines a light on the extent of Russian activity designed to subvert Ukraine. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the political correction.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world.
If you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
Welcome back to the Political Correction. So today is a religious day for many of us, but we acknowledge that faith comes in all shapes and sizes. That's why each week on the Political Correction we aim to talk to someone at the heart of their community to talk about what brings us together. In other words, where is our common ground? This week we are joined by the Reverend Dr. Gavin Ashenden, who is an author, theologian and former chaplain to the Queen. You're very welcome, Gavin, to the programme. And you want to, first of all, kick off with a story in the Sunday Times.
Yes, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me join the conversation. So there are three stories. The first one is science and COVID. The second, ACAS and racism. And last of all, gambling. But the first one's to do with the war, the Sunday Times tells us, that's broken out between scientists over COVID. So we all know that what viruses do is that they start off by being very dangerous and then they become less dangerous and more infectious. And the question is, have we got to the point where COVID has become sufficiently less dangerous and more infectious to allow us to lower some of the barriers that we've had to live with for the last 2 years, barriers that have been inhuman, problematic socially, psychologically, and for all our communities. So some scientists obviously think it's time, and other scientists think it isn't. It's very difficult for most of us because we're not scientists. I have enough trouble with the graphs that keep on cropping up on my Twitter account. But what we do have is a division in society that seems to mirror, in some ways, the Brexit division. Half of society on one side and half on the other. Half risk takers, half after safety. Half of our society seems to want to give up its liberty for safety. And if the government will only promise it will keep us safe, it's happy to surrender free speech and autonomy. And the other half of society says our free speech and our autonomy are too important to give up. And I think perhaps at the back of this, I think partly lies a vacuum in faith. If all we have is our lives as they presently are, and there's no sense that they have any value in future beyond our death, it's very difficult not to be afraid and to give in to authoritarian governments. I think one of the things that we want to do as a society now, since I belong to the half of society that wants free speech and autonomy, and doesn't want to be terrorized into giving up my freedoms, is to find ways of thinking about our lives and how we order them and what they're worth, that allows us to hold at bay some of the pressures that government and control authoritarian figures want to impose on us.
Gavin, I heard you say a moment ago that you weren't a scientist and you very modestly talked about the difficulty in understanding some of this. But would you agree perhaps that one of the things that has gone wrong is that the floor has been given over entirely to scientists, that there needed to be a debate about many other aspects? I mean, I think of, discussing what was happening to the economy, what was happening to people's mental health, and so on. You bring another dimension, what was the faith element in all of this? But I wonder whether at the end of all of this, we ought not to be a little more sceptical when advice is coming from only one quarter. I mean, I'm sure these people in the health lobby were doing it with good intentions, and of course they had every reason to err on the side of caution. But there are many other aspects that need to come into a national debate. You've introduced one of them this morning.
Well, that's true, and I don't want to push faith too hard, but I think there are a number of languages that we can use. Obviously, science, not everyone is qualified. Faith, well, not everyone believes. But I think the one thing that we can all talk about and ought to be more sophisticated over is power. It's the abuse of power, I think, that has disturbed most of us. And the problem is the abuse of power seems to have taken place by invoking scientific language that few people want to use. In the past, it's absolutely true. Religions have done the same thing. Religions have played the same trick. They've used sophisticated language in order to impose power on other people. And my sense is that the two great dynamics for human life are power on the one hand and compassion and forgiveness on the other, which is one of the reasons why I take a religious attitude on life. But I think we need to be able to hold our politicians to account when they appear to abuse power and do it on the back of a sort of scientific closed communist speak.
Before you move on to your second story, Gavin, I'm interested to hear, I mean, obviously there was the whole discussion about closing public worship down and everything going online and all of this. Were you surprised at how easy people seemed to accept that?
Do you know, I'm still shocked. I was at Mass this morning thinking they weren't particularly good hymns, and I was thinking, for goodness sake, you should be so glad to be singing hymns at all since they closed the doors. And so one of the things that this hiatus has done is to make me incredibly glad for open churches and hymn singing. But I was completely shocked. I mean, it's hard to explain, in fact, how astonished I was that people who have responsibility for the churches were willing to give way, particularly as we look back in the history of the 20th century, when both from the left and from the right, totalitarian forces tried to close churches and to make them conform. We really ought to have both a better memory historically, but also a better sense of our category of ethics and hierarchy. For those of us who believe, we have predecessors who sold their lives for belief. Yes. I can't believe that we gave up our freedoms so cheaply.
Well, on the subject of totalitarianism, you've got a story in the Sunday Telegraph which makes a comparison with East Germany, the old East Germany, the old GDR.
Yes, this is quite extraordinary. The facts are really quite simple, and they're not, in one sense, they're not hugely important because it's the pattern that matters. But there's a man called Sean Corby who's a senior conciliator at ACAS. I mean, that means that he's probably pretty right on, pretty politically correct, or he wouldn't get a job at ACAS in the first place. And there's a very nice picture of him and his wife. And Sean is white, and his wife is a woman of colour, or a coloured woman, or she comes from Africa, whatever we're allowed or not allowed to say. But the fact is, they're a mixed marriage. Well, of all the people in the world you wouldn't want to accuse of racism, you'd start with Sean Corby. And yet, because he wrote a memo about equality, in fact, he even linked it to a GB News presenter, Anaya Florian, which he argued that currently fashionable conceptions of marginalized identities are incompatible with a fearless exchange of ideas. In other words, we can't have people stopping us talking and thinking by accusing us of thought crime. And the problem is that racism is also a form of thought crime. Now, we've moved from the awful days in the 1950s when I grew up, when people put notices on their windows saying no gypsies and no Irish. We've moved, which was reprehensible. Of course, all form of distinction of that kind between human beings is reprehensible, whether it's based on colour or class, for that matter. But we've moved to a point where racism has become a Trojan horse for thought crime. And one of the problems we have is we don't seem to have a name for the cultural war that we're in that allows us to want to draw a line and resist and say, we must hold people accountable only for what they do, not for what we claim that they think. And the fact that racism has become thought crime par excellence, and nobody has a defense against it. If they accuse you of being a racist for whatever reason, you can't say, look at my mixed marriage, how can you possibly imagine that to be? And it's this lack of defense against thought crime that is immensely problematic. And the difficulty is that every single year we slip further and further into what the Sunday Times has called the East German syndrome, further towards a totalitarian society where people can control what you think and what you say.
And yes, indeed. And there are many institutions of government and of state now that if you receive even a WhatsApp message from somebody else, then you are subject to disciplinary action, even though you didn't send it, if you don't delete it and get rid of it immediately and what have you. So it is quite worrying for employees and indeed for big institutions, Gavin.
Well, we don't seem to have found a way of naming it yet, and we all agree that there are ethical virtues that human beings ought to pursue, both individually and socially. But there isn't a single analysis of what's happening to us. I mean, in Communism 1.0, it was perfectly clear that the proletariat were rising up to take control of it and create an egalitarian society. But with the cultural Marxism that we have now, it's much more difficult to find a name and a diagnosis we can all agree on. And without being able to diagnose it, we can't find a prognosis for it.
Gavin, let's move you on to your third topic, which I think is gambling.
Yes, I've been very surprised on my phone at how often I'm invited to join a gambling game. I'm somebody who so mistrusts my mathematical literacy that I'm unwilling even to do the national lottery. I think gambling is it's enormously serious and very dangerous. And the trouble is, it appeals particularly to the one group who ought to be defended against it, and that is the people who are mathematically challenged and poor. So the article in the Sunday Times talks about gambling firms being the new big tobacco. Why do they use that particular language? Because for 20 or 30 years, everybody knew that tobacco caused cancer, and nobody called it out on it. And it took a very long time indeed for restrictions to be imposed and people to be helped deal with what was a deceptive addiction. And gambling is the same. It's a deceptive addiction. And we really ought to do better than simply allow big business, I guess you'd call it that, entrepreneurial capitalism, which in itself is neither good nor bad. It's just a thing. But it becomes bad when we don't monitor it, when we don't call it to account. And the problem here is that the kids in particular, young children, are being lured into gambling on the grounds that it's exciting, it might solve their problems. There are all kinds of reasons for wanting to gamble, and people should be free to if they want, but we shouldn't inflict the appetite for gambling on people who can resist it least and will be damaged by it most, without taking some prohibitive care about it. And no one appears to be taking that level of responsibility at the moment.
And Gavin, what is the libertarian argument for interfering with people's right to gamble?
Well, I don't think there is one. I think there has to be a right to gamble, because if you're a libertarian, then you believe in freedom of choice and you hope people will learn lessons. But I think one of the things you do from a libertarian point of view is you give people as much information as possible. And if you give them if you A, give them information, and B, stop them being preyed on by rapacious people who distort the information, I think that's the best you can do. And certainly my view of the ads that come on my phone is I'm really one short step away from being a millionaire at almost no cost to myself. Well, that's the rapacious disinformation that I think should be attended to. But otherwise, of course, people should be free to do what they want, but given as much information and education as possible in order to make the best choices and then learn from our mistakes.
Gavin, thank you so much for joining us on Common Ground today. We've been talking about addictions, and AA might mean Alcoholics Anonymous, but it also means Automobile Association.
It does.
And you have a story about that, don't you?
Well, this was a story that caught our eye. It was essentially a lady had broken down and she contacted the AA as a lone female. She thought that she should get priority. She was told by the call handler that she wouldn't get priority for that reason. Everybody had to be treated the same, whether you were male or female. The AA have apologised for leaving this lone female in that way. But I suppose really, Michael, it comes down to risk. And is a woman on her own on a dark road in the middle of the night more at risk than a male? And my view is she is.
I'd like Paul to come next.
I agree, Arlene. I think she is. And my broad view is, look, the equalities agenda in this country has done much good over recent years. There's no question about that. But I think this is an example of where a rigid belief in it can lead you to make, frankly, ridiculous and indefensible decisions, in my view. I think the vast majority of people in this country would probably look at that situation where a lone driver, a female driver, was on her own in the dark and asked the AA, can I be prioritised? And they responded by saying no, because of equalities, you have to be treated equally. And I think it highlights really just how big corporations and organisations are completely petrified of doing anything that is seen to contradict the equalities agenda.
I wonder whether an effeminate man in the same situation might be in danger. I wonder whether you ask a woman whether she wants to be prioritised, whether you'd always get the same answer. I think it's quite tricky. I mean, I think probably in the end, I don't want to be awkward about this, I think I probably do agree with you that a lone woman is in a more vulnerable position than others. But I want to keep that argument, as it were, within bounds, because, for example, an argument has grown up both in the Republic of Ireland and in London about the particular danger in which women find themselves. And the dangers have been demonstrated in two awful cases to be great. But, of course, the greatest vulnerability in London is black young men, where about 30, I think, have been murdered in the last year. So all these attempts to categorise can be, I think, quite unhelpful. I think in the end I'm prepared to concede to you the case of the lone woman on the road.
Well, I'll take that concession and bank that concession. Of course, if you drill down into any potential scenario, then it becomes endless, doesn't it? But it just strikes me as being sensible that if an AA controller knows that a lone woman has broken down in the dark, it seems to me reasonable to say that woman, and sure, if we want to ask that woman if she wants to be prioritised, but if you bring it back to personal circumstances, if I broke down in the dark and my wife separately broke down in the dark, I would very much want her to be prioritised in that situation over me, and I suspect most people.
Well, I think it is a tension. I think that's right, between equality and safety, isn't that right? the safety of the woman. And there has been a lot of discussion around, Michael's absolutely right, about violence against women and girls and the need to protect women and girls and the need for men to accept they have to change their culture and their attitude towards women. But I just think this is a simple point that doesn't need to be extrapolated upon. If you're a lone woman, there's a risk, and therefore that risk should be put in. And some younger women may find that patronising. I accept that. But for me, if I was on the road and I broke down and I rang the AA and they told me, no, we can't prioritise you because you're a lone woman on a dark road, I would be troubled by that.
So maybe the AA's policy ought to be to ask the woman in question. First of all, of course, they have to assume it's a woman from the voice.
Yeah.
To ask the woman in question whether she wishes to be prioritised. I think we're probably a bit late in the programme now to ask people for their responses and have an opportunity to read them out on television.
Yeah.
But I think it would be quite interesting to know how many women would feel patronised by that question and whether there would be any sort of generational divide in the answers that were coming in.
And I think probably, if we're honest about it, it's a manifestation of this idea that there's no difference between the sexes.
Sure.
Which a lot of people, we had a discussion with Tom Harwood last week on the show. There's an idea abroad that actually gender fluidity, there's no difference in the sexes, therefore we have to treat people rigidly the same regardless of their sex. And as I say, that leads you to make what I think are unjustified decisions like that.
I just want to squeeze a story in if I can, Paul, because you've been quite exercised about the BBC archives and the fact that there's been some work going on there as well.
Yeah, the story that BBC editors are secretly editing certain phrases and certain scenes from old programmes, such as Dad's Army being an example, because they think that we may not use that phrase today and come to their own judgment about it. But this kind of filtering out of history, it does irritate me, I'll be blunt.
Of course, I'm sympathetic to what you say, but if you have the responsibility in the BBC for this archive which is being released, you are still the editor of that material and you're putting it out today, so you have an editorial responsibility which is today's, not yesterday's. There are some questions to which there are not easy answers. I think this is one of them. I think maybe this material ought to dwell in its entirety in a special archive which is the history of the BBC, and you access it as a way of looking at the history, and therefore it remains untouched. But if it's out there as though it was still the continuing entertainment of the BBC, with references to Jimmy Savile and what's his name, Rolf Harris. Rolf Harris. I can see that's problematic for a BBC editor.
Well, I'm not sure. OK, there may be an argument to say that Jimmy Savile, because of the horror of his crimes, and Rolf Harris, you wouldn't necessarily want to give those people publicity. But simply including what at the time was everyday dialogue and was culturally mainstream at the time, it just seems to me that it's an attempt to rewrite history. It's an attempt to present something not as it actually was. And yes, you don't necessarily want to blame individual editors because they may be working under the instructions of people above them. But let's just treat each other like grown-ups. Let's understand this was the culture at the time. We may not like parts of it. We may not agree with parts of it. But let's not treat people like kids.
Well, I think the Jimmy Savile, Rolf Harris is slightly different insofar as the criminality involved there, but what the BBC editors are involved, as I understand, is they're taking parts out of shows if they think it's offensive now, as opposed to not being offensive in the 70s, and I think that's the problem.
And they get introduced. I've seen Dad's Army repeats recently on the BBC where they're introduced with warnings, with offence warnings. We're talking about Corporal Jones, for goodness sake, and Fraser and Mannering. These people weren't offensive. The idea that the nation needs a warning before watching that sort of slapstick comedy, it's madness, isn't it?
Well,
I'd be interested in views.
Well, unfortunately, we haven't that long on the programme to have views sent in, but please do send them in and we might pick them up next week. But we have a few views in here that I just want to cover before we finish off. On Biden, Sheila says, Biden's friend is defending the president. He has stood by and watched violence and shooting across America even before he got into office, and since he is completely left-wing and defending a joke of a president.
And on Biden, Andy says, with reference to Afghanistan, Churchill was not a success because he lost, but because he won. He retreated to save the British Army. You're talking about Dunkirk, presumably, so we could go back and win. Biden has fled and got no victory from the retreat, which is completely different.
A very fair point, actually, when you think about it.
And Tom says Biden is not a patch on Reagan. Reagan was fading towards the end of his second term, but not from the beginning of his first.
I think that's a fair point as well. And Peter says, I respect Biden's friend, but he cannot see the USA. But can he not see that the USA has been destroyed from within? It shows love is blind. And Paul, just your final reflection.
Yeah, Tom says, prediction, the election result will be overturned. Trump will be back. Remember, I said it. I think that particular boat has sailed.
Well, listen, thanks for all your emails and tweets today. We really enjoy getting them and reading them out. The Political Correction will be back next Sunday from 10. Coming up next on GB News, it's Alistair Stewart and friends. Don't go away.
And it's largely dry for many of us, but mainly cloudy skies are expected too. Looking at the details then, a cloudy morning expected across southwest England. Perhaps a few bright or sunny spells developing as we head towards lunchtime. Highs of about 8 Celsius with light winds for all. Grey skies overhead London and southeast of England too. It should remain dry though, feeling chilly with highs of 7. Winds remaining pretty light. Wales should see some of the brightest weather. Cloud will come and go, but there will be sunny spells, staying pretty chilly though. The Midlands, largely cloudy, should stay dry. There could be a few glimmers of sunshine from time to time. Temperatures just about 6. Winds remaining light throughout. Large amounts of cloud across northern England, the best of any cloud breaks to the east of the Pennines. Temperatures towards the coast about 8 Celsius. Patchy rain and brisk winds will continue across northwest Scotland through the day. Drier conditions are expected elsewhere with some sunshine in the east. Maximum temperatures of about 7 Celsius. Now, moving on to Northern Ireland, should remain dry through the rest of the morning. Some bright or sunny breaks developing by lunchtime. Temperatures of about 7 Celsius and the winds will stay pretty light. Often cloudy through the rest of the day across the UK. Rain and strong winds continuing across northwest Scotland. And that's how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Hello there, I'm Eamon.
And I'm Isabel.
And you're watching the GB News digital stream across the United Kingdom.
And around the world. If
you're here in the UK, you can also watch us on your TV screen. GB News is Freeview channel 236.
On Sky, we're channel 515.
626 on Virgin Media.
Just remember, you might need to retune your TV to watch the channel.
Yeah, and if you are doing that, find out more about retuning by going to gbnews.uk.
Join my show, Farrar, 7 p.m.